Okay, folks, so been a moment. Apologies about that. I realize more and more every day how it's one of those things where I take some time to think about things, maybe too much time to think about things, but reality is for me as it is, and I have other things to take care of, so like we all do. But this is the second installment for the astrology, astromancy for 2021. And today we're going to be really talking about some foundational concepts that I think need to be in place, things we need to be able to think with as we go about doing the work that we're talking about doing. And I've been sitting with a few of these pieces for a little bit now, and I feel like I'm ready to say something about it. And, as part of this type of material that I make available in this way, I think that you are going to get me in a slightly more raw form than maybe would be desirable. But at the same time, I think that, again, take it or leave it. It is what it is. I've been spending a lot of time with this text. This is The Moment of Astrology, Origins and Divination by Geoffrey Cornelius. This book is so important. It was published in 97, I believe. But for anybody that knows Robert Hand, this is the quote on the back, is it's one of the most important astrological books of our time, a book which every astrologer concerned with the philosophy of astrology must confront. Well reasoned, presented a position that can allow astrology not only to defend itself, but to go on the offensive against the prevailing reality paradigm. We live in a time where the split between objective and subjective reality is very firm, at least from the perspective of what is valued. And I think that astrology, and particularly prediction, but astrology in general, stands in defiance to this sort of split, but also is bound up in this split. And this is something I want to explore with us today, because thinking about this is an important piece when it comes to making sense of the how of astrology, which I think when we get involved in the how to do astrology, which is probably a super important piece. Like, I do think it is a super important piece. Get on with the astrology already. It is important that we, as people engaging in astrology in this time, are open to sitting with and asking ourselves the question of the philosophy behind astrology, or even we might say the metaphysics behind astrology. And I brought this up in the first video, and I tried to do my best at that time to address some of my concerns, particularly around that question. But it's come to me now that we need to do a little bit more. We need to have more with us, ideas to think with, what we are doing. And I think to do this, we are going to turn now to some of what Geoffrey Cornelius is bringing to the fore, which is that around the time of the Hellenistic era with astrology, we have a change where Ptolemy, in particular, which is a very important Hellenistic era astrological compiler, but also an astrologer in his own right around many things. But Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos is a foundational text in understanding early conceptions of how we make sense of the how or why of astrology. And I think that within this, what we need to understand is that we're wanting to think about this moment. So we're thinking first, second century AD, and prior to it, and then after it. And what I'd like to lead with is that because of some of the way that this stuff lays in terms of the timeline, but also potentially in terms of the cycle of thinking with these ideas, I've often tried to conceptualize of astrology and astrologers as being children of this problem. And what is this problem? I think this problem is the split between subjective experience and objective experience, or the subjective impulse and the objective impulse, if you will, or view. And why do I say this? I think astrology, as we understand it, is really emerging out of the moment in time that is about making sense of the rationalizing and quantifying of our reality. And you can see this very clearly when you look at someone like Ptolemy, because Ptolemy is attempting to basically rationalize astrology. And in order to do this, Ptolemy puts forth a doctrine called that at least Geoffrey Cornelius calls the doctrine of origin. And fundamentally what's being said by this is that in this case we can say an origin chart like a natal chart, or anything that we can say is the beginning of something. This is functional as a way of understanding because it is causal. In this conception of astrology, it's a causal temporal dimension, which is saying that really the positions of the luminaries and the planets are causing the things that are unfolding in the life. They are responsible, but also causing it to occur. And if you look at where this is coming from, this is definitely a piece of this is coming out of Aristotle, and the Aristotelian turn towards, again, the rationalizing and the quantifying and the logical orientation that is being taken there. And in this case, the planets are objective. We can all perceive their positions and where they are. And it's linked to this moment in time. It is an origin, so it's aligned with that doctrine of origin. And depending on our philosophical orientation, we can either say what the Stoics did, which is that these things shall come to pass, and it's about accepting them. It is a fatalism, if you will, or determinism based on this. And astrological determinism, I do think, is something that astrology has carried with it as it moves forward. But this is something that we need to question. And the reason that is because this concept does not sit very well with astrology prior to this period. And I don't think it sits very well with practices that we engage in astrology. And I think it doesn't sit well with us as astrologers, especially if you're a consulting astrologer or a horary astrologer. It doesn't sit well because the chart is representing signs, and signs are very different than causes. So a lot of Ptolemy's work is around, as I said, is fundamentally linked with the planet's actually causing fate to unfold in the way that it does. And you can see how this becomes more and more important as we develop astrology as representing cosmic principles at play that are separate from us. They are objective. They are not something that we are inferring. They are outside of us, and it's being done to us, whether we're looking at it or not. So in this way, it's a scientific astrology, if you will. And it has a rhythm and a regulation, which is more complex than a lot of other cycle systems, we might add, because there's a lot of different cycles that are running simultaneously. But there are a lot of things that this doesn't account for. One being the perception, two being the interpretation, and three being the reality of the symbolic, which I think is another one that is so important that we get our head around if we're going to effectively divine slash predict slash forecast, whatever word it is that you're wanting to use to think about these things, towards a way of wayfinding using astrology or astromancy in this time. And to take a step back, I think it's really easy to do with these two terms that I've chosen to really be important words for this course, and that is astrology and astromancy. And if we look at the origins of these words, which we could go into a lot, Astro is the most straightforward of all of it, which is referring to the stars. And the second part of these words is very interesting because Logion is obviously very much bound up in a term that has fundamental power in Western thought called logos. And Logion is a derivation or a word, again, bound up with logos. I won't go into the technical pieces too much because maybe I don't even understand it. So the thing there is that logos and the mantic, are actually two words that share a lot of similarity in their origin, but then over time they start to sort of drift from each other. And with logos in general, in this way we're talking about it, it's both are interestingly about pronouncements and are about speaking and words. But logos as a word comes to mean discourse, or all the words, if you will, or collecting the words, which is getting closer to this word logion, which is about words and accumulating them. But then it also, as we get to the religions of the book of Judaism and Christianity, and to some extent I would imagine in Islam, we have logos representing more and more the word. And later, as it moves into certain ways of thought, and you can see this in different philosophers as well, it's a way of speaking that brings about a response or reaction. And ultimately, it leads in the direction of us having it being the logical principle, or not the logical, the ordering principle of reality. So it's something that's giving shape to reality. And there's this in itself, exploring this could be a whole thing. But at the beginning, we're with pronouncements. Okay? And Mancy is a word that I think sits better to some of the origins of astrology, in that Mancy is also about pronouncement. But here we are with, fundamentally, we are with the oracular, and we are with the pronouncements that come from the gods, and both of them actually have this link in terms of their etymology and the usage and way in which we played with these words, because language users, we are very good at playing with words and letting them develop over time. And so here we have two words that mean something very different. But then towards the end, of where we are now, one is seen as almost like a science. Astrology is, and a lot of astrologers would argue that it is a science, and that it follows a scientific method, if you will, to come in what it's trying to express. Whereas the astromantic is more, again, there's something more subjective about it, something more tainted with the subjective, if we really want to look at this distinction between objective and subjective sources of knowledge and insight. And this is precisely why I wanted to use these words, is because I myself, as an astrologer, and what I'd like to try to get you to sit with as we move forward, is trying to reconcile these things within myself. And I think that this is completely what has been going on within the field of astrology for quite a long time in the modern era, and is also what's going on within many different sources of knowledge or practices, which is over time there's sort of a purging of the subjective, that the subjective is not trustworthy, the subjective is open to being diluted, and because of that we need to purify all subjective input to the point that we are left again with these completely objective principles that are ordering our world. And you can see how this is tipped into the scientism that we experience today, which is that it's almost like a religious view that has established that anything outside of what we can deem objective is false and is not to be trusted. It's like the new version of the thing that we need to avoid. And we see how this really hit its peak, I believe, in the 19th century, or in the 20th century. I think it really hit its peak, the explanatory power. And then very important things start happening even within the field of science, where we're now paying attention to the fact that, oh, well, the observer is actually shaping certain things about outcomes and of experimentation. So even in science, it's no longer entirely possible to purge this subjective quality of things. And I do think, when we do astrology, and particularly when we see that it works, we are kind of struck by the way in which the symbolism is able to feel completely separate from us. And in that way, it's appears entirely external and objective, and it appears to, and some of the practices that we do in astrology utilize this objectifying mind to kind of move in the direction of making sense of, say seeing a birth chart, or seeing a mundane chart where we're looking at how transits may be affecting an inception chart of a country, or again, even looking at transits in general. And I think that what we need to understand around this, and why I'm leaving it as something for us to think with, so we can really get on with the next step, which is now let's look with what's coming, is we need to understand that as much as our practice of looking may obscure our own eye as we look at it, and as much as it may obscure the context and the interdependence of the chart's interpretation, we can very easily start to pick apart what all needs to be present for an astrologer to interpret a chart. One, there has to be a chart in this context. We astrologers are very focused on the chart. The chart itself is a representation based on tradition, and we can follow various traditions around that. So we've got the astrologer, the perceiver, we've got the chart, which is something that is like a sign that we're trying to understand. It's arising out of a tradition of looking at these things, which is based on actual position of planets and other types of information in the sky that's mathematically derived, which again is coming out of tradition. We need the symbol objects, which are in this case the planets, and the for lack, maybe we can talk about the archetypal core that is there with them, or the convention. We could also talk about the convention around those symbol objects that we're talking about in the chart, and simultaneously that they are actually linked to certain ways of measuring movement of the planets and the luminaries in our sky as it's seen from Earth. Next we have the context, and this one is often super obscured. When we do interpretation, what is the context? Because in natal astrology, knowing the context, even if the context is the individual, or if the context is my work or my health, these are all things that create context for us as we look at the chart. Next, we have the fact that we have a consciousness, and that our consciousness is actually the vehicle through which we are able to perceive and then be able to give rise to an interpretation. And then we have all the things that unfold. If it's a consultation, we have all the things that unfold between the person who is the consulter and the person who's being consulted, or the consultant and the consulted. And I think that all of these things have a way of dancing, and they some of them are more obscured than others. But the thing that Geoffrey Cornelius is really bringing up in the moment of astrology is this idea of astrology having originated within the practice of divination, and particularly ancient divination, or divination in the ancient world. And many philosophers and many different people talk about the way in which our consciousness as human beings really changed very much over our deeper past, us being in a time that is dominated by mythos, where story, symbol, they are, appearing to arise from this mythic experience that human beings are having, towards more one of logos, which becomes more important. The ordering principles become more important, and they're scrutinizing and trying to get to grips with them. And in particular, Geoffrey Cornelius is looking at the practices of divination that were important in the past, in particularly divination by the flight of birds, we could say, or by meteorological conditions, by the weather. We really see it here, more true to what astrology is, in my opinion, is if we look at it as being similar to the flight of birds, we know that the flight of birds may not, the flight of birds are signs of change. They represent, they themselves are a change, and that's, I think, the objective piece around it that's important. And why I think us as children of this problem are uniquely geared to finding some resolution or solution or reconciliation with some of these things. And I guarantee you, if you really sit with it, that there's something quite fundamental for you as a person interested in astrology or interested in topics of magic that has really grappled with the objective-subjective split that we have inherited from what began really at the beginning of the first millennium, and then was elaborated more and more as it went forward in different ways and different iterations, and is really coming to a head now. I think that so many things about our lives are really trying to present how when we reconcile these two ways of splitting reality, if you will. And I think that to go back to it, the participatory nature, which is what I've really been wanting to encourage us to get clear about as we move forward with this work that you may feel called to participate in, but at the same time, something that I'm trying to understand more and more, is the participatory nature of astrology we see so present in earlier forms of divination, where it is not about complete fate, which is what arises, this sort of fated, absolutely fated idea of, say, what the divination entails, is not something that we see in ancient forms of astrology, because you can ask what the will, a lot of ancient divination systems, be they the examination of a cow's liver, which is especially in the Babylonian or the Mesopotamian cultures, was one that was very concurrent with the origins of the Babylonian astral divination, and which later those practices of astral divination really came to eclipse, being the ultimate version of it, was that you are looking to understand the will of the gods. And we see this echoed in many ancient cultures. We want to know if what we're about to do will be aligned with the will of the gods. And what's interesting about that, and where magic kind of lays so nicely in it, and why I'm trying to get us to understand more this way of approaching astrology a little bit, and where I think the astrological magical and then also the magical tradition, bar none, is also super wrapped up in being a child of this problem, of this splitting, this fundamental splitting and denying of the subjective as a valuable source of information. What the gods declared was in their will, was actually up for negotiation. You could appease them, you could, it wasn't set in stone. And if you look at some fundamental principles of particularly Hellenistic astrology, and I think this is being represented by the lots, if you're familiar with the lots of fortune, or TK, fortune, the lot of daimon, or it's often translated as the lot of spirit, the lot of eros, and the lot of necessity, we're really seeing some fundamental ways in which the astrology that's arising at that time is trying to make sense of how things can be fated, how things can be participated within, what's our participation within fate, what is the driving force behind all of it, and what are the things that we must endure and suffer in our life. You see this in the symbolism of Hellenistic era astrology very clearly. And you also see at that time, depending on your philosophical inclination at that time, whether or not things are completely fated or if they are negotiable. And so what the basic principle I would like us to bring into the fore is something to think with. If we think of astrology as divination, we are there with what Geoffrey Cornelius calls the take. It's about our view. And by that what I mean is that all those things coming together, the us as the astrologer, the chart, the history of looking at things in this way, the planets themselves, which are represented on that chart, and then also our interpretation. All of this is arising, and also, as I said, the symbol object, all of this is arising within this context. And it's keeping all of that clear for us. And also that the moment in which we begin to look at a chart is a meaningful moment. It's a conversation that we are having with all of these layers, and ultimately with the cosmos, And getting clear about this allows us to become clearer and clearer about allowing the cosmos to speak to us again, which I think back in those times, or even for contemporary cultures now, still, they probably have a better grasp of what we would call the mythic experience of being mixed into reality, as opposed to the one that is all pushing totally towards the objectifying and the external to us. It doesn't, and in this case, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if we look at the charts. It doesn't matter if the astrologer even tries to make an attempt to interpret. And this is something that is carried forward with us, this Ptolemaic inheritance that's kind of carried forward with us and has been unquestioned by astrology going forward. And so again, this idea of the temporal causal is what we're seeing when we look at a chart. And we know, I mean, the point really is that it's so detached from what's actually happening when we look at a chart, and what those things. It's not about causation, the temporal causal. It's about signs. And in order to interpret and understand signs, we need to understand their embeddedness and the interpretation of signs as being completely embedded within all of these many factors coming together to spontaneously give rise to delineation of the astrologer, the interpretation, or in this case, as Geoffrey Cornelius says, our take. But it's basically the creative production of the astrologer themselves, you know. So anyway, why is this relevant as we're trying to look forward to understanding what is to come to pass with the astrology of 2021? The reason it is important is because not paying attention to them obscures the fundamental dynamics that are going on underneath and within the practice of doing astrology. And this is why I think acknowledging the position of the person who is doing the interpreting, the astrologer in this case, and the astrologer's consciousness, which is able to, is really part of the thing that is really driving forth the creative production, is so important. And I think this is what we'll turn to next is, well, what do the spirits have to say about this? Because ancient divination had a lot of things to say about the spirits, particularly the daimons, and the guiding spirit, if you will, and its ability to assist in this. And many ancient and modern critiques of astrology say that its ultimate validity is derived through the inspiration of a guiding spirit. And this can be viewed from either side as good or bad, you can imagine. But I'll leave you with this for now, because I think that it's important that we not get too overloaded at the moment. Some things to think with. There's a bunch of goodies coming your way. I realize more and more how much I sort of find New Year to be really registering normally with the Lunar New Year, which is February 12th. So don't be worried about it. There's going to be a lot more to say. And my main thing I would say now, the recording of this video is at the moment of Uranus stationing direct. That Mars has finally moved into Taurus, is making its way over to Uranus, which is setting the stage and putting in motion a lot of things around the Saturn-Uranus squares that we're going to encounter, which we haven't had the first one perfect yet, but we are getting the fully adrenalized Mars expression of some of the things that need to take place for that to occur. And the things that are quite radical, which are the things maybe resonating with the Uranus register, they are being adrenalized as well, especially as Uranus is stationing direct. And there's more to come. It's not just about my consciousness perceiving this, it's about all of our consciousness perceiving this and making sense of this together, which I think again is such an important piece. This work requires lots of diviners, lots of astrologers, lots of astromancers, and also for us to rediscover what is negotiable within what is fated. So I leave this with you, child of this problem as well. Some things to think about. I cannot overemphasize how important this book is. Even if you're not interested in horary astrology, The Moment of Astrology, Origins and Divination by Geoffrey Cornelius, I agree with Robert Hand, is a fundamentally important text around looking at the philosophical underpinnings of our astrology in the moment that we live in. So very aptly named The Moment of Astrology. Until next time, I hope that you are well. Lean into whatever levels of joy you can experience. I know that January for many of us has felt like a 13th month of 2020. I think that after the Lunar New Year, February 12th, I think we will see certain things starting to have a little bit of lift. It doesn't change. It's not like switching a switch on and off. And we are coming from a heavy place already. So, within that heaviness, whatever your context is, lean into joy. I do think that this is the best thing. And I think that this time, for us that have maybe had a lot of practice with it, is a time that does favor the simple joys of life. Until next time, I will hopefully have a live session and more interactive as ahead of time, and people can pose some questions. We can begin to look at some charts, but this is giving us something to think with. Not causal temporal, but interconnected participatory astrology.